Recording. There we go. All right. All right, everybody. Welcome to the Weird Walk Home. I am your host, Artemaeus Treadwell, and I'm going to deviate a little bit from the project that I've been working on recently. If any of you have been watching the channel, we had a series that we were putting out called the Intermediary Diaries, where I was essentially vlogging about my experience with Tillie Treadwell, my wife, almost the last 10 years now, and what I how my life has changed essentially since being with an intermediary. But I want to deviate a little bit from that project right now because I am very grateful to have the opportunity to talk to Mr. Tim Swartz here. He has joined us for an episode about the Darby Spook, aka Jeff the Mongoose. And my so my normal policy about paranormal information is that I try not to learn very much about paranormal experiences or anything outside of, my normal day to day, because when I have paranormal experiences, I don't want them to be biased or contain information that might, shift my perspective or my storytelling that might to align with someone else's. I want whatever I have to be able to be compared genuinely with somebody else's to see if there are things that overlap and if it may actually have been a bona fide paranormal experience, whatever that might be. But Jeff the Mongoose I'm going to take exception with this story because Tillie told me that I absolutely needed to talk about this. And Mr. Tim Swartz apparently is an aficionado of Jeff the Mongoose. So I did not want to miss an opportunity to talk to him about this experience because I think there are many, many different things that we can tie to this story. And again, I think Tim is a perfect person to talk to. Briefly, for the audience, for anybody that doesn't know who Tim is, I'm going to let him take a few moments to fill everybody in on his illustrious career within the paranormal. So take it away, Tim.
Well, hi, Artemaeus. Thank you very much for having me on tonight. It's a great pleasure to talk with you.
Yeah, same here.
Well, gosh, what c- what can I say? I mean, I'm nobody. I mean, I just make this stuff all up, and no. I'm sorry. I'm being flippant. I'm being flippant here.
Sure. Sure.
You know, uh, this kind of stuff I have been fascinated with for years. Now, unlike a lot of people that I'm sure you've talked to who have said that, oh, well, I mean, ever since I was a little kid, or maybe they'll say that they had some kind of, like weird experience that got them into it. But I mean, as for me, it was a little bit different because as a kid, I really wasn't that interested in this kind of stuff. I grew up in Indiana, so I mean, my interest was like race cars, like the Indianapolis 500 race cars, stuff like that. I did have a fascination with science and the space program, which was going on at the time. When I was growing up, you had the Gemini and the Apollo programs, and reaching for the moon, and so that held my fascination. But in elementary school, and I think I was around in third grade, the teacher used to assign everybody, like once a week headlines from a like a kid-based newspaper that we would get that would come from Scholastic books,
Yep.
and it would be an aggregate of the past week's top headlines. So she would assign everybody a different headline from this paper, and it was our job then to write a little essay about it, and then you would have to present it in front of the class. One week, I got a story about UFOs. Now, at the time, I don't think that I had ever heard of UFOs before. So I wrote what I could, gave my presentation, and from that time on, then, I was known as the guy who believed in flying saucers and little green
Oh
men from
no.
Mars. And like I said, I had no interest in this kind of stuff. But
Sure.
no, you believe in flying saucers and little green men from Mars. You know how kids are. That's the
Sure.
way it was.
Sure.
And and of course, a small town that I grew up in, then the word got around, and everybody knew. Oh, yeah, what can you do? You're pegged.
All right.
But
Yeah, you're stuck.
yeah, yeah, it's true.
Right.
I was stuck in that role, which
Mm,
I suppose, considering some of the other things I could have been stuck with,
yeah,
that one wasn't so bad.
that is true. Yep.
Yeah, you know how kids are. I
Uh,
mean,
yeah.
I could have been the kid who ate ants. You know?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Or any other embarrassing story. Insert
Right,
multitude
right,
of
yeah.
options.
But what ended up catching my attention and drawing me into all of this was the fact that people would come to me. I mean, as a group, everyone makes fun of you and things like that. But then later, they'd come to me as individuals and say, I don't believe in this kind of stuff, but. And
Yeah.
then they'd proceed to tell me a story about, their family saw a UFO while they were on vacation, or,
Mm,
they've been seeing their grandmother at the foot of their bed, even though grandmother had died a month before.
mhm.
Stories like that. And that's what really got me interested. The stories were interesting, sure, but it was the fact that these stories were coming from people who had no interest really in letting anybody else know or seeking any kind of publicity for it. They instead were confused, befuddled by this experience. And if you think about it, most people have no real knowledge about this kind of stuff. Sorry, I hit my microphone. Um, and when you have an experience that is outside of the norm, because we all have our daily experiences, and we kind of move about our lives almost like robots, almost like we're asleep in our day-to-day activities. You get up, you have breakfast, you drive to work, do your work, come home, eat dinner, go to bed.
Mm,
Get up the next day, repeat. Now, say during that time you're driving to work and this flying saucer comes down and lands in front of your car. Little guys get out, collect rocks and leaves and things, get back in and fly away. How do you process that? That's
mm,
not part of your normal routine. For
mm.
most people, where do you categorize that? There's no place you can't put that into, having breakfast and coffee. Uh,
Yeah.
so a lot of people, they A, try to forget about it and ignore it. B, think they're crazy.
Mhm.
Or C, kind of a little of A and B.
Yeah. Right.
So when they come to me to and are nice enough to trust me enough to tell me this story. And
Mhm.
again, this is a story that they probably haven't told anybody else for
Right.
fear of ridicule.
Mhm.
Can't tell your family. Family's worst. You'll be the butt of the joke for every Thanksgiving for the next 20 years.
Right.
You can't talk about it with with the people you work with.
Mm,
You talk about being pegged as a weirdo when you're in elementary school. Just think
sure.
how it would be as an adult trying to tell somebody that, you saw little gray guys, coming out of a flying saucer.
Right.
So the fact that they would come to me and tell me this story, not wanting publicity, not wanting to make money out of it, they just want a first of all, they just want to get it off their chest.
Sure.
Second, they want that reassurance that they're not crazy.
Right.
You know, that is the main concern I think with a lot of people. Am I crazy? Did I see this? Am I losing it?
Sure.
And and I tell them, say, you're not the only one who's had experiences like this. You're not
Mhm.
alone.
Mhm.
And you can see the weight lifted off of their shoulders after they tell this story. And they walk away, and they may never ever tell anybody else ever again. But the fact that
Mhm.
they shared it with me and they got that reassurance that it's happened to other people, and sure, it's weird, we can't explain it, but you're not crazy. You
Right.
probably did see what you thought you saw.
Mhm.
And that is what really has driven me all of these years with these types of experiences, is these personal experiences from people who aren't looking for publicity or making money, but they've had something profoundly weird happen in their life. And you would be surprised how many people out there, I would say practically everybody at least one point in their life has had something weird happen to them, and they've either
Yeah.
just forgotten about it or tried to ignore it,
Mhm.
whatever. So
Yeah.
to me, that is really what is fascinating. The people who, go out on the lecture circuit, talking about their experiences are the ones that I'm least interested in. It's these other stories. It's these other people. The
Yeah.
silent group, so to
Mm.
speak.
Sure.
And there's a
Yeah.
lot more of them out there than there are, people talking about it. So that
Sure.
that really is what has got me into all of this and has kept me going all of these years.
Yeah, and with Zontar Press, your publishing company, I assume that you have put out mounds and volumes of these types of stories for people to gain some, I mean, as you may have put it, some comfort in the fact that these things genuinely are shared, these experiences are shared by others, and that sort of relief that you're giving to people is, well, as you said, what keeps you going. I think that's admirable, certainly. And the thing that they share in common with actually with the people who's told Jeff's story. So the Irvings of Dolish Kashen, they uh they too did not, aim to profit at all from telling the story. And in fact, them being a farming family, I said, well, not necessarily a farming family, but they lived, in that house up on the hill sort of,
Yeah.
trope where they were away from society and experiencing this. They really risked much further. What would you call that, exile essentially from the community
Hmm.
and telling this sort of story, but they continued to tell it. And even what I was reading up on recently, the the teenage daughter, the youngest one who'd had the most, I guess, interaction with Jeff, while she, denounced the relationship in, so many years because she just didn't want anything to do with it. She did eventually give one more interview that said, yeah, I mean, it was real. I did not want to profit from this in any way, shape, or form, but she believes it was a genuine experience.
Hmm.
As you said, from just some folks who, like anybody else, didn't seek to profit from it, just wanted to share that with others in perhaps the hopes of connecting and maybe expanding their worldview outside of, as you said, the day to day, get up, eat, brush your teeth, and go to work, and the what I feel like people eventually come to realize is not the totality of their life, that there is something more than that, so it's Jeff encompasses so many other interesting things that I can't wait to talk to you about. If for anybody that hasn't heard of this story, I guess a very brief mention. It was a family, like I said, on the Isle of Man, who they moved out to this farmhouse out in the country and started hearing some, scratching, like it was an animal somewhere behind the walls in this old farmhouse that they had. And the father started to hear words being spoken from this being. And so he was playing with it back and forth, perhaps thinking like he was teaching it English language,
Hmm.
until eventually it was seen as, well, some people say that it took on many different forms, but the most common form was a mongoose. And that when the father asked, "Are you a mongoose?" he said, "I am." and then and then as the father explains, proceeded to say that there was a puddle of urine that appeared on the floor as I guess a gift from Jeff to indicate that he was indeed real. And that I laughed so hard when I heard that it went from, this, father thinking that he's teaching some being to speak English to, a fully formed response of, I am indeed a mongoose and I'm going to pee on your floor. It's just like the ultimate troll response. And I just thought this is going to be great. And, reading more about it, I want to get your opinion on what you think Jeff was, because I've read other people's opinions, what they thought he might have been. I certainly have my own opinions about what he might have been, but I'm very curious with you having collected all of the stories that you have over the years, talked to so many different people, what you think Jeff may have been.
Sure. Well, let me give you just like a little bit of a synopsis of the events leading up to
Mm.
Jeff.
Yes.
The Irvings, Mr. and Mrs. Irving, and then their young daughter Vori,
Mhm.
which I guess is a I can't remember what the word would be, but it's like a version of the name Mary, but it's
Mm.
Vori with a V.
Mhm. Okay.
They were an older couple. He had been a piano salesman in England and was pretty successful at it, and made enough money that he decided when it was time to retire that he was going to buy some land on the Isle of Man, and they had already, now you have to remember, like they're an older couple and they already had two grown children who had moved out and started families of their own. So Vori came around. She was kind of a surprise. So you have this
Mhm.
older couple with a young daughter. So they bought this plot of land, and the area that the house stood was very, very rural. I mean, at that time, the Isle of Man was pretty rural to begin with. There were towns and villages scattered around it, but where they were located, it was like basically a dirt path to get to the house, and then from that dirt path, you then had to walk uphill quite a ways to get to the house itself. The house itself was pretty old to begin with the possibility that it was part of an even older structure, like maybe pre-Christian
Mhm.
buildings and things like that. People have been living, on the island for centuries upon centuries.
Sure.
So, what James Irving did when he first moved was that he renovated this stone house. One of the things that he did was, because there was no insulation at all, it was
Mm.
just a stone house, is that he put up wooden panels on the interior of the house. And in order to create some natural insulation, he left about a 2 to, I think, 4 inch gap in between the stone walls and this wooden paneling.
Mhm.
And this, it was in this gap through all the walls throughout the house where Jeff he made that his home when he did make his
Yeah.
appearance.
Mhm.
Now, James' idea was that he was going to be a gentleman farmer, which meant that he would have hired hands to do all the work,
Mhm.
and he would, be the manager type of situation. He really wouldn't do any of the farming, his hired hands would do it. But unfortunately, about the only thing that they were able to raise was sheep. The crops didn't work. Not really good land for cattle or anything like that, but it was good for sheep. But that wasn't very profitable.
Mhm.
So they quickly ran through their retirement funds and were just, kind of living from, week to week. So at one point, they had been living there at least a couple of years. Jim saw some kind of small, unusual animal in the farmyard, and he had chickens, and he was kind of worried that this thing, he couldn't identify it, but he thought maybe it was like like a fox or a polecat or or something
Mhm.
like that, but he wasn't sure. So he shot at it and missed, and it disappeared, and he thought, well, that's the end of that. But then eventually, he come to realize that it may have moved inside the house because they were hearing something scrabbling around in the walls.
Mhm.
Now, anybody who's ever had a house out in the country, or heck, even in the city, you know that you can get, mice and squirrels and raccoons, in your house really easily.
Right.
So that's what he was thinking, was going on. And, they tried putting out traps and stuff, and and nothing would work. Well, then whatever this was in the walls started making noise, started making growling and hissing and things like that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I guess one evening, Jim, just on a lark, started repeating back whatever this animal was doing. If it growled, he growled back at it. If it hissed, he hissed back. And then it would do the same thing back to him.
Mhm.
So eventually it started making almost, as he described it, like baby like noises.
Mhm. Yeah.
Ba 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 la, 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 things like that. And so he would repeat, and it just got to be, almost a game for them to do. And eventually, this then coalesced into words. Jim would start saying words, and it would repeat these words back. So, of course, that's kind of weird.
Mhm.
They were, and at first they thought, well, maybe this is some kind of bird. Maybe a crow or a raven has gotten inside because those kind of birds can talk if you teach them.
Mhm.
But they kept, Vori especially, occasionally would catch a glimpse outside of, again, some kind of furry animal that moved too quick for them to, to really get a good look at it. So they come to slowly realize that this was some kind of mammal, some kind of furry creature in their wall. How it
Mhm.
was talking, they had no idea. But eventually, and again, he would say like nursery rhymes or sing little children's song, and
Mhm.
it started mimicking these things back. And then eventually it started to talk on its own, which
Mhm.
showed that it wasn't just mimicking, there was an intelligence behind it.
Mhm.
And that's really how it all started. And eventually, during their conversations, it said that its name was Jeff, Gef, and that it was a mongoose. And
Mhm.
it had originally been born in India and had been brought over, um, I can't remember now, like maybe 50 years previously
Mhm.
by another farmer who lived on the island with other mongoose to take care of the rabbit population. Because the rabbits were kind of taking over and eating all the crops, and they were trying to
Mhm.
come up with ways, and a mongoose is really a really good rabbit
Mhm.
catcher.
Yes.
But he's Jeff said that it wasn't until Jim actually took the time to, start talking with him that he learned how to talk.
Mhm.
Even though obviously it had some kind of intelligence behind it, but it wasn't until Jim arrived that it learned to talk. And once it started talking, you couldn't shut it the hell up.
Yeah, right.
it
Like a kid, you
talked
know.
it talked all the time, and its voice was very distinctive. I guess it was very high pitched,
Mhm.
shrill, as it was
Mhm.
described. Almost, what you would expect, like a little animal, a little, little, weaselly type of animal to sound like.
Sure.
Um, but the odd thing about it is that there was more to this than just a talking animal, which I mean that's enough, right?
Yeah.
Um, there was other phenomena that seemed to be taking place. You mentioned the puddles of urine.
Yes.
Well, not only, and you have to remember that this paneling that's on the house, there were natural knot holes, in
Mhm.
this paneling where
Right.
Jeff said that he could look out and
Right.
watch everybody, and
Mhm.
plus the ceiling had beams across it that Jeff could run across, or hide and watch everybody from the ceiling.
Mhm.
And Jeff had a fondness for throwing things,
Mhm.
stealing things, but not only could he pee on you, but he could also create high pressure streams of water from
Mhm.
these knot holes
Yes.
that would just unexpectedly, it was like somebody had like a super soaker,
Yeah. Yeah.
a squirt gun.
Right.
Sometimes it would just be water.
Yeah.
Other times it would be, other things.
Questionable.
Jeff had a very tricksterish sense of
Mhm.
humor.
Mhm.
So, there was this poltergeist type of
Mhm.
element
Mhm.
to all this, which is, I mean, that's one of the things that has made this story so mystifying over the years. I mean, yeah, it's weird enough that you have this animal who could talk and obviously had an intelligence, but then there were these almost paranormal aspects to it as well
Mhm.
that was very difficult to explain. And but all the while, Jeff claimed, excuse me, that it was a physical animal. It wasn't a ghost.
Mhm.
It was a living, even though old, a creature. And in fact,
Mhm.
Jeff claimed to be terrified of ghosts, which is really funny.
That is
And
interesting.
Jeff would love it when Jim and his wife Maggie would tell ghost stories,
Huh.
which is really that's really weird. I mean, here this
That is.
creature
Yeah.
is, and I mean he loved to be scared with ghost stories, so it's just really such a bizarre and mystifying story. I mean, it's no wonder that everyone who hears it is so fascinated by it.
Sure. Yeah. And the documentary that I had listened to, it was gosh, probably the better part of over an hour, had also mentioned some other aspects of the experience that just, as if what you gave, which brilliant. Thank you very much for that recap for the audience. That was incredibly inclusive. As if that was not enough in the spectrum of experiences that this being not only created and put out, but I heard more from this documentary that said that the Jeff could tell what other members of the family were doing who weren't even on the property at the time. That he had a sense of what would you call that? Extrasensory perception. Remote viewing, essentially, sight at a distance, and that just as easily as he would find things, funny and playful, or be keenly interested in a friendship with the family, with the Irvings. Also in this documentary, this person said that Jeff had occasionally made comments that were very threatening and menacing, like, I could, if I wanted to, kill you at any point, but never did. And perhaps partly because James had shot at him in the beginning, and also had actually heard he had attempted to poison Jeff in the very beginning before he realized that Jeff perhaps was not as simple as a mongoose, and that Jeff even toyed with him a little bit by, wailing and screaming periodically in the night, as if he had been poisoned, and then would, follow with some silence, and then, no, just kidding, and then come
Just
back with,
kidding, yeah.
yeah, more pestering, So like, just the whole breadth of experiences, it's almost like it runs through the whole spectrum of human archetypes and human, personalities. And
Mhm.
so I that's why I kind of wanted to ask you, because my realm of knowledge and the lens through which I tend to see the world and all of my paranormal experiences, whether it's right or not, is through, I guess, the human psyche and evolutionary biology. Why we see what we see, and I guess the nature of some of the things that we experience may just be a reflection of ourselves. Um, so I don't know, you know, further to that point, what you think Jeff was. I know you said it could have been, some poltergeist material, could also have been, you said he wasn't a ghost, but has these memories from, other places that he had been. So what do you think Jeff was? I know that's a tough
Well,
question. I
yeah,
thought
well,
about it
and
too.
you have to understand that I never have a belief system of any kind
Mhm. Mhm.
with these kinds of subjects because that kind of then bookmarks you
Right.
into constantly defending that belief system, even when presented, with contrary evidence.
Right.
But in my speculations, and in the book that I wrote, and it's called Jeff the Talking Mongoose: The Eighth Wonder of the World. We present several different possible ideas from an actual mutant animal that somehow developed intelligence and longevity because apparently if you go by its claims, I mean it was over 100 years old at that
Mhm.
point, to a poltergeist, some sort of poltergeist, whatever a poltergeist is, even though it claimed it was a material, it was a living material animal, and showed all the evidence that it was because it would eat. It would, urinate, defecate. It could kill rabbits. It
Right.
could, steal things. I mean, it did all the things that a living creature could do. One of my favorite, though, ideas is that maybe it could have been some kind of like what was referred to at that time as the spirit of the hearth. And
Mhm.
it was thought on a number of places throughout Europe that houses had, um, and I can't remember what the words were that they would use, but they would be like the equivalent of like a house goblin or brownie, or or
Sure.
not
Yeah.
so much of a fairy, but they
Mhm.
were referred to as spirits of the hearth, and this would be something, some kind of like nature spirit that lived in the house with you, that a lot of times was centered around the hearth of your house, because that the hearth was always like the centermost a part of a household. And
Mhm.
if you treated it well, it would treat you well. It would take care of your family,
Mhm.
things like that. And I just more and more, I come to think that maybe Jeff was something along those lines.
Mhm.
Some kind of non human intelligence that defies our any kind of explanation that we can come up with. Like you said, we tend to be very, naturally human centric,
Sure.
and it's difficult to see outside of that tunnel vision, that to see
Mhm.
outside of the box. And I just wonder if Jeff may have been one of the last of these types of beings that used to live with us. And if, like I said, if we took care of them, they took care of us.
Mhm.
And as modern times have progressed over the entire world, we've kind of like shoved these things back out into the woods and fields and out of our homes. We don't believe in them anymore. So they no longer have an important place in our lives. So, it could be. I mean, and because of Jeff's very tricksterish nature, again, that makes me just think along these lines because like the your house goblins, and I'm using the word goblin because or you could say brownie as
Sure, sure.
well.
Mhm.
When people think of goblin, they think of these little hunched
Right.
over
Yep.
nasty creatures, but
Mhm.
I mean, they could be really any way that they wanted to be, including a talking mongoose.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
um, but again, because of Jeff's tricksterous nature, it does. It keeps me constantly looking at that as a possible explanation. But again, who knows? All we know is that this did happen, despite the skeptics and the critics, who have tried to find fault with this family and their story. I'm convinced that it actually did happen.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you on so many points. I would first like to really give appreciation for your disclaimer about how, once you kind of take a position, then it almost becomes dogmatic and you feel like you have to defend that. And it does
Right.
sort of pigeonhole you into a belief system and keeps you from perhaps seeing other, very real potentials. So
Mhm.
in asking you, what you thought Jeff was, I really appreciate that, you gave that first before giving your opinion on what you think it may have been, because that's a good reminder, I think, for so many people to really be mindful of, on a day to day basis to try to avoid that cognitive trap. But also, on another hand, in this modern day, people like to think that because they're scientific and they know more, that it kind of pushes them away from these belief systems of the past that precisely for the fact that they didn't know much, they were more humble in that way.
Mhm.
And I think we're more willing to be cooperative and respectful of those things that, we're essentially the bigger fish, because people were put in their place. And I think that ego is one of those things that now is just becoming so big and out of control with the population that you may be right that the a reason that a lot of these non-human entities like the hearth spirits or goblins, whatever name you want to use for them, less and less interact with humans on that kind of level because humans don't think that they should have to be, I guess, believing of or respectful of things that they don't have quote unquote proof for, because
Mhm.
they think they know everything. And that may be why we're seeing less of those entities, because there just isn't that, like you said, that just mutual respect in that way, which, the more I learn about non-human psychology, the more I certainly understand why, between their differences and the way humans, at least today especially, are, why they pull back from interaction in that way.
Mhm.
So it's a little sad to me because I think we're losing connection and mutual benefit from a lot of this ancient wisdom and experiences of the past that we would poo-poo on it because it's oh, it's old, it's they were um dumb, they didn't know any better because they didn't have science or whatever. But I think that is a very egotistical, narcissistic, um, head up your butt kind of way to really go about things. And like I said, the more paranormal experiences I have, I'm reeling back away from that to see. So when I
Yeah.
came across Jeff, that the way that I started, seeing it was similar, very similar to how you saw it, that it was a non-human entity that I think part of the reason, a reason that would explain this, vast spectrum of behavior that Jeff was giving was just a reflection of different human archetypes, basically. Or you
Mhm.
could just call them, archetypes in general. But what I've learned about non-human psychology is that because they are so generally they are so egoless, low ego content that it is just as easy for them to say, all right, well, if you want me to be this thing and you want me to interact with you on this level, I have no problem. I will interact with you on that level and I'll be a mongoose. I'll be a trickster mongoose. I'll, threaten you. I'll love you. I'll, whatever these things are in any given moment that the human wants to see, they will see. But there comes a point where, again, like you said, if they're not being respected, if they don't you don't believe in them, there's almost no contractual reason for them to engage, at least on that level. There are other ways that they can engage, and we certainly see that, but less do we see the Jeff the talking mongoose, which to me is such a loss for in so many ways, for humanity. There's so much there.
Mm.
But I don't know. I kind of rambled on a little bit, but I don't know if you had any thoughts to add
Well,
to that exactly.
well, the Isle of Man had a very rich tradition of nature spirits and fairies, and I mean they had their own a pantheon with various names and things like that. But by the 1930s, which is when this all took place, it was definitely waning. And in fact, the other people on the islands were very concerned about what was going on, at College Gaps. Um, and they referred to it as the spook,
Hmm.
um, rather. And I think that maybe some of the really old timers, were considering that this may be, like one of the old types of nature spirits that used to be on the island. And you have to remember that Jeff exhibited a lot of the types of emotions that have often been attributed to nature spirits, fairies, goblins, and brownies. He was very volatile. He
Hmm.
would be just as quick to laugh and have fun and then turn around and throw a temper tantrum.
Hmm.
And if you got on his wrong side, if you got on his bad side, that's, you would be on his bad side for quite a while. And it
Hmm.
would take a lot for you to, get back, on his
Yeah.
good side
Right.
again.
Yeah.
Um, and plus, like you said, Jeff had the ability to tell, like what the family members were doing at a distance. One of the things that Jeff liked to do was that he would travel. He would disappear from the Irving's house, for days at a time, and then come back with stories of how he was wandering around the island, visiting other people. He liked to. He claimed that he would ride underneath the bus that would take him into the main town and then hang out in the little bus station and listen to people's conversations. And then he would come back and tell the Irvings all of the gossip that he had learned. Jeff was I mean, he loved gossip.
Yeah.
And and he would he would reveal. He loved to reveal secrets. There were no secrets on the island, I guess, when it came to
Mhm.
Jeff, because he could hear it all, and that made the other people who lived on the island even more suspicious of the Irvings because
Sure.
of this. Nobody wants to think that everything that you do, that this whatever it was listening and watching you and then going back and revealing your deepest darkest secrets.
Right.
So yeah, I mean there was some consternation between the other people on the island and the Irvings. And you have to remember also, the Irvings were newcomers to the island. They had only been living there for a few years compared to most of the other people who who grew up there and lived
Mhm.
there all their lives. Their fathers, their mothers, their grandparents lived on the island. So here are these weirdos from England
Right.
moving in, thinking they're so much better than everybody else, and then having this weird thing happening at their house. So
Sure.
I mean the Irvings kind of became pariahs to a
Yeah.
certain extent with the other people on the island. Yeah, even though at the pinnacle of what of all this is going on, a lot of people, neighbors, townspeople, would come up to the house to try to hear Jeff. Sometimes he would cooperate.
Hmm.
Usually, if strangers would come into the house, he would refuse to talk or cooperate.
Right.
He was very mistrustful of strangers. But a lot of times, if people were outside of the house, they could hear Jeff inside screaming and cussing. Oh yeah,
Hmm.
I should add to this that Jeff had a very colorful vocabulary, and
Yes.
I guess used curse words like a sailor.
Hmm.
I
Yep.
mean, curse words, I guess, were like a second language,
Yep.
to him.
Yep.
He could use them. He could use curse words, like a violinist, could play the
Hmm.
violin. So,
Yes.
but everybody always reported that same kind of very high pitched screeching type of voice when it talked and screamed.
Yeah, yeah, and just yeah, the incredible array of behaviors and experiences with Jeff. Just I've been thinking about it for some time, trying to connect the dots and just what in the world could have contributed to all of that because it doesn't match. Really, it's the only story that I've heard of. Again, I don't do a lot of research into that, but the only one that I've heard of that just had such a rich depth and breadth of experiences to give that I had to talk to you about it because you wrote the book essentially to get more on what you thought about that. What sort of conglomeration of paranormal experiences could we be seeing, or could it be something that, I mean, as you said, is something that we generally don't see anymore, but perhaps was at one time a much more common experience where maybe that's where all of the folklore of that area comes from. The Irish fairy tales and
Mhm.
the Fey folk and things like of that nature. Seems like he almost resembles much of that, at least of the non-human psychology of the
Mhm.
Fey, but
Yeah,
without
yeah.
being one.
Very, very much so. And, I mean, all the research that I have done over the years, the story of Jeff is unique, very unique. I have not run across really anything. There's been, a couple of stories here or there that are somewhat similar, but not much.
Mhm. Sure.
Nothing as um, quite like Jeff that lasted as long because I mean this was something that lasted for years. Usually, like with a poltergeist case, it'll peter out after maybe a couple of years or so. Usually
Sure.
much shorter time than that. But no, I mean this went on for about a decade, maybe even a
Mhm.
little bit more.
Mhm.
And it's a very unique story, which to me, I mean, that makes it even more fascinating, because you would think that if it was a hoax,
Mhm.
somehow if it was a hoax, that somebody else would have attempted this over the years, but nobody
Sure.
has. And
Yeah.
and as a paranormal phenomena, it's never happened again either. So that's what makes it even more interesting to me.
Sure. Yeah. So many elements of it that for somebody to try to replicate that, I think would just fail miserably because as it is just replicating one aspect of a paranormal experience, like a disembodied voice or a mist or a cold spot or maybe a UFO or Bigfoot sighting or something of that nature, we can always look at it and go, yeah, I don't know, I think I can kind of explain that. But a talking mongoose whose voice could be heard by other people who could remote view, who could kill rabbits, who would leave puddles of urine, who would have, maniacal laughter and trickster-like behavior to, loving, friendship sort of thing. I mean, just literally, it has so many elements, and then all the non-human psychology on top of it. I cannot imagine anybody even being able to remotely duplicate that again. So, and it's just so many elements of it that just absolutely tickle me too. So many things to think about, and something that I wanted to bring, to the audience because I'm honestly, for as big of a story as Jeff was, back in the 1930s, because there are numerous, newspaper clippings and articles and interviews from the family and so many and people that came to investigate. I know there was, I forget, it was some, big British publishing or British news agency or something. Someone came, a colonel, I think he was, or lieutenant, I can't remember, some military figure came to investigate, and over time was eventually convinced of the situation, even though at first Jeff said he hated this this guy and would not come out and speak to him or show himself as a result. But I mean, it's highly documented, to say all that, and that now when people talk about paranormal experiences, it's almost like it's hardly ever heard of, which just blows my mind. So I felt like, for us to keep talking about it, keep that memory and that experience around for us to learn from and consider, if for nothing else, for what you mentioned, which is the whole aspect of being mutually respectful of things that, maybe we don't believe in it, but to just be humble and respectful, something that humans generally are losing touch with very, very quickly this day and age, that I think is a recipe for disaster, honestly. And, through the paranormal experiences that I've had anyway, that I, bring to the audience, Jeff is one of those that I feel like needs to be kept alive. That story needs to be kept alive for, consideration of people that interact with it on so many levels. So I greatly appreciate you retelling that story much far better than I did, jumping right into the, puddle of pee on the floor, which just tickled me, but giving much better background than I did to tell people about this so that they can go and even look it up and do some research and just open up their minds a little bit to this, possibility of something more, which is what, the paranormal tends to do to people. As you said, it opens up their mind, gets them out of that, narrow blinder day to day situation to help them uh, grow, really, and to know more is to improve on so many levels, whether it's information that might be difficult to handle, but nonetheless, that sort of thing I think is a gift to give. So I greatly appreciate you being here to give us that background about Jeff, to talk about it a little bit, have that conversation, help other people keep talking about it and learning from it. Is there anything else that you wanted to give, kind of, notes or thoughts specifically about Jeff that you wanted anybody to remember, or things that stick out to you, maybe?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the nice things about this case is that Jim kept a diary, a day-to-day diary on all the things that Jeff did. And I mean, he was very meticulous about it. And I mean, they would just be, really just almost mundane types of things. I mean, Jim would put like cloudy today, temperatures, in the 40s. Jeff caught a rabbit and left it on the porch for us, announcing that, he had strangled it out in the garden and that we could have it for supper. Things like that.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't for him keeping these meticulous notes, a lot of this information would have been lost to us. You
Hmm.
know, and one of the other aspects is that, naturally, even at that time, it was suspected that this was a hoax, that somebody in the Irving family was pulling a fast one. Um, it kind of centered on Jim's wife, Maggie, and his daughter, Vori, who at this point was around 13 years old when all this really, was taking place. Um, and the suspicion was is that they were unhappy, living in this rural environment and wanted
Sure.
to move back to England. So they concocted this wild story of Jeff, the Dalby spook, in
Mhm.
order to scare their dad into moving out and going back to England, which, if that was the case, it had the opposite effect because Jim
Right.
became just enamored with what was going on.
Right.
And I mean, just really, I mean, this was just, such, a fascinating situation for him. And one of the other aspects is that Vori was accused of being a ventriloquist,
Mhm.
that
Right.
she had the ability to throw her voice and to make it sound like that, Jeff was coming from the walls or from the bushes or things like that. And in fact, her classmates said that she could throw her voice, in the classroom. Now, at that time in the 30s, it was still believed that a ventriloquist could throw their voice. That
Mhm.
instead of being just a simple thing of misdirection, with a
Mhm.
dummy, people are looking at the dummy talking and not
Right.
at you as hide your lips. But they were thinking that a real ventriloquist could actually throw their voice inside the closet or things like that. And
Mhm.
and and Vori, when she did years later, when she was an adult, and a reporter for Fate magazine actually found her and tracked her down, and she agreed to an interview. She told him, that, yeah, people were saying that I was a ventriloquist. And she said, now, honestly, if I was that good of a ventriloquist, I would not have, gone and moved to England and started working in a factory. No,
Right.
I would be on stage, making all kinds of showbiz money. But
Right.
that didn't happen, did it?
Exactly. Yep. And to
And
your earlier point too about, if had it been, just a ruse to get Jim to move back to the city, then it would have, if Rory and Maggie were behind it, they would have dropped it, and quit, in hopes that, eventually he would forget it and move on. But the phenomenon continued. Why keep it up if their goal was to, get Jim to move back to the city and, spook him? And it, as you
right.
said,
Well,
it did not work.
yeah, well, and the other thing too is that you have to remember that Jim and Maggie had already raised two other children who were adults and
Mhm.
had their own families at that point.
Right.
They weren't stupid people. They
Mhm.
hadn't just fallen off the turnip truck somewhere. They
Right.
knew all the tricks that a kid can play on you. And
Mhm.
if Vori had been trying to fool them somehow by doing Jeff,
Mhm.
they would have caught on really fast. I mean,
Sure.
anybody who's a parent,
Mhm.
will know what their kids are up to and what they're capable of. So
Sure.
to think that if Vori was doing this, that she was able to fool her parents all of these years, with Jeff is just that to me that's ridiculous. There's no way. No way. I mean, I
Yeah.
don't care, because people think that, oh well, they were just dumb, but they
Right.
weren't.
No. No.
I mean, these were people who were educated.
Right.
I mean, they were older at this point, and like I said, they already had grown children, so they knew all the tricks, that a kid could pull. No,
Yep.
they were just as mystified by this phenomena as everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. So
Yeah.
my skeptical brain, every which way that I had thought about it, and all the ways that you've presented, it just you continuously come back to this was a genuine paranormal experience, the likes of which we have not essentially seen, since and prior to that. So very awesome.
Yeah, well, and Vori, I mean, she admitted in that interview after she was an adult that first of all, it was all true. Everything that they said happened happened.
Mhm.
but she said she wished that it hadn't because she said it ruined her life. She
Right.
said that she had to really live anonymously because she was always afraid, and she never got married. She said she was always afraid that somebody, like a potential husband, would find out who she was
Right.
and not be interested in her because, there's that crazy girl who had the Dolby spook.
Mm-hmm.
And she said it ruined her life. So
Yeah.
now if somebody was perpetuating a hoax when they were a kid, at this point you would think that they would have come clean. I mean, what would she have to lose at this point, right? I
Right.
mean, as an adult, she's like, yeah, I was just doing it for a lark. But no,
Sure.
she said no, it actually happened. It all actually happened.
Yeah, and I mean, as proof of as a sign of the changing times, Vori, you and Vori have quite a bit in common that you were both at a young age pegged with the paranormal tag, and her life turned out very differently than yours. You know, you have received much better reception than poor Vori did in her life, and I think that is this in the post disclosure world that we're living in now. I think it's more important than ever to really take stock in our own psyches and be much more mindful about these things to come,
Hmm.
because I think we've got a lot to learn still. So,
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
but
It would have been interesting if to find out if after she was an adult and had moved away, whether or not she had other types of paranormal experiences. Because I bet she did. Maybe
mm,
not along the same lines as Jeff, but
mhm,
I just bet that there was some kind of energy interplay between
mhm,
her and Jeff, and possibly Maggie too. Maybe all of them.
mhm,
There probably was some kind of energetic connection going on with all of them and Jeff that helped sustain him. Um,
mhm.
because when it got to the point, I guess, where Jeff would go away and would stay away longer and longer. And then eventually, Vori, when she turned 18, and this was around the time that England was going into war with Germany, she
Mhm.
moved back to England to work in war factories. And at that point, Jeff just kind of faded away. Um, he was all, like I said, he was already starting to fade away, but after she left, he was pretty much gone. Now, one of their adult children, Jim, had gotten sick and was on his deathbed basically, and his other adult daughter had come to the island to stay with them for a while. To watch over Jim as he was dying, and
Mhm.
she said that she saw some poltergeist types of phenomena, but
Mhm.
very low level, things moving around,
Mhm.
but no talking or urine squirting out of the wall or things like that.
Right. Sure.
So there was some kind of residual energy still at place, which may have been part of the environment itself. That location may have had that energy there, just waiting for the right kind of people to
Mhm.
come and activate it or reactivate it.
Sure.
Again, going back to this nature spirit idea that, under the right conditions and the right people, you can give life, to these things for as long as you are able to feed it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that actually, so as the land acting as the originating energy, and then humans as an amplifier,
Mhm.
essentially. And that brings to mind, this is going to maybe seem like a totally off the wall reference, but in the movie Hook, Robin Williams plays Peter Banning, and oh goodness, Dustin Hoffman, I think, plays Hook.
Yes. Yes.
Julia Roberts plays Tinkerbell. So there's a scene in that movie where Robin Williams, Peter, has gone to I can't remember if he's gone to Neverland yet or if he's still, in the, on Earth. But Julia Roberts as Tinkerbell appears to him, and he's, all wide-eyed, like I can't believe I'm seeing a tiny human, and making all sorts of jokes that only Robin Williams could make. But he basically shouts to her, "I don't believe in fairies," and Julia Roberts begins to kind of like, fade away and, oh, no, Peter, you have to say that you believe in me or I'm going to pass away. I'm going to die. And she starts to faint, and fall over. And, Robin Williams repeats, he yells, "I don't believe in fairies." And, she feigns, fainting and falling down. And then basically tells Peter, "You have to tell me that you believe in me for me to, reanimate, come back to life, basically." And so, she says, "Clap for me, clap, clap, louder, louder, louder," to kind of give some sort of, indicator that he does believe. And, I didn't really think of anything at the time in that movie other than that, similar stories have been told, like the Polar Express. I don't know if you've
Hmm.
heard that one, where in order to, if you believe in Santa Claus, then you can hear, the little jingle bell that was given as a gift from Santa. But if you don't believe, you can't hear the bell anymore. So, this idea that, what we believe gives power to, these sorts of things is a recurring theme and something that seems to follow right along with Jeff, in the sense that, and furthermore, people today, if they do not believe, now this, of course, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, if you do not believe in the paranormal, a lot of people probably would not have much paranormal experience until maybe someday there's a, one-off thing, and that might change their mind. But
Hmm.
in general, that belief is what amplifies, brings, sustains that sort of being or energy around. And again, one more reason to be incredibly mindful of what it is that we're, thinking and believing and feeding, because one way or the other, whether you are cognitive, conscious of it or not, they're there. There is no such thing as privacy, I don't think. So it's all around. So, but anyway, yeah. So
That's right. That's right. Well,
awesome.
I mean, and just remember, reality was once thoughts. So,
Exactly. Yep. Before it became an actual manifestation. So that
right.
is a perfect note, I think, to conclude the episode on. Normally, my videos on the channel are, gosh, at most maybe 15 minutes long. So we've gone just about an hour, which is great. Everything in here, I think, is absolutely outstanding and worth, talking about again and again and again. So Tim, I again greatly appreciate you coming on, sharing all of your knowledge on this topic for our discussion today, and for moving forward anybody else to look into more about Jeff the Talking Mongoose, aka the Darby Spook of Dolish Kashen. And yeah, I think that'll probably do it for this episode. More to come, but again, thank you very much, Tim, and we'll see you all next time for our next adventure on the Weird Walk Home. Take care.
All right. My pleasure. Thank you.